Edmund Johnson believed in justice the way some people believe in miracles. Quietly, desperately, with everything he had. At 26, Edmund was already known in his firm as the one who worked late, spoke gently, and never walked away from a case just because it looked ugly. He had grown up watching his mother lose everything to a system that never listened, and somewhere along the way he had sworn he would become the kind of man who made people hurt. That morning, rain pressed against the glass walls of his office like a warning. He didn't know yet that his life was about to fracture. "Your new client is here." Edmund looked up from his desk, heart thudding softly. He straightened his tie, closed a file in front of him, and stood. "Send him in." The door opened. Joe London walked into Edmund's world without making a sound. He was tall, dressed in black from coat to shoes, his movements restrained, controlled. His dark hair was neatly combed, his jaw sharp, his expression carved from something harder than indifference. There was a quiet heaviness around him, like grief had learned how to wear a human body. Their eyes met. Edmund felt it instantly, a strange pull in his chest, a tightening in his throat. Joe's gaze was steady but empty, as though he'd already seen too much of life and decided none of it was worth reacting to anymore. Joe took the chair across from Edmund without being asked. No smile, no greeting, just silence. Edmund cleared his throat. "Mr. London, I'm Edmund Johnson. I'll be representing you." Joe gave a slow nod. "I know." His voice was low, rough around the edges, like it had been worn down by too many sleepless nights. Edmund opened the case file, but his eyes kept drifting back to Joe's hands. There were faint scars along his knuckles. His fingers trembled once before, curling into fists. "Financial misconduct charges?" Edmund began carefully. "The prosecution claims you diverted funds from your company over a 2-year period." Joe didn't react. "I didn't." The words were simple, flat, final. Edmund studied him. "Then we'll prove that." Something flickered in Joe's eyes. Surprise, maybe, or disbelief. People usually looked at Joe London like he was already guilty. His face had been splashed across headlines for weeks. Social media had devoured him alive. Former friends had vanished. His family hadn't returned a single call. Edmund had read it all. But sitting here, face to face, he saw something else entirely. He saw exhaustion carved into bone. As Edmund flipped through documents, he noticed a thin silver chain slipping from beneath Joe's collar. Hanging from it was a ring, worn smooth with memory. Edmund hesitated. "Are you married?" Joe's jaw tightened. "No." His hand rose slowly, tucking the chain back beneath his shirt with the kind of care usually reserved for fragile things. Edmund swallowed. "I'll need you to walk me through everything. From the beginning." Joe leaned back in his chair, eyes drifting toward the rain-streaked windows. "My fiancée died 3 years ago." The words hit Edmund like a sudden drop. Joe continued, voice distant. "Hit and run. They never found the driver." Edmund froze, pen hovering above paper. "I shut down after that. Left the company to run itself. Trusted people I shouldn't have." Joe let out a breath that sounded more like defeat than air. "By the time I came back, everything was gone. Somehow, I became the villain in my own story." Edmund felt something ache inside him. "I'm sorry," he said quietly. Joe looked back at him, then truly looked at him, and Edmund nearly forgot how to breathe. There was so much pain in those eyes. "So is everyone," Joe replied, "until they decide I deserve it." Edmund leaned forward. "You don't." Joe studied him for a long moment. "You don't even know me." "I know you're scared," Edmund said forward. "You don't." Joe studied him for a long moment. "You don't even know me." "I know you're scared," Edmund said softly. "I know you're tired, and I know you're telling the truth." Joe's lips parted slightly. No one had said that to him in a long time. A fragile silence settled between them. As Edmund reached across the desk to slide a document toward Joe, his fingers brushed Joe's hand by accident. Joe flinched. It was subtle, barely noticeable, but Edmund saw it. He pulled back immediately. "Sorry." Joe shook his head. "It's fine." But his shoulders were tense now, his posture defensive. They went through statements, timelines, witness lists. Joe answered every question with brutal honesty, never embellishing, never asking for sympathy. Yet beneath every word was the echo of a man who had already lost everything worth protecting. When the meeting ended, Joe stood. "Thank you," he said, though it sounded more like habit than gratitude. Edmund rose as well. "I'll fight for you. I promise." Joe hesitated at the door. He turned halfway back. "Don't." Edmund blinked. "What?" "Don't fight too hard." Joe's voice was quiet. "People who get close to me always end up broken." Then he left. The door closed softly behind him. Edmund remained standstill, heart pounding his ears. He didn't understand it yet, but something irreversible had just begun. As he sat back down, staring at the empty chair across from him, Edmund realized with sudden clarity that he was already emotionally entangled with a man who looked like he had long ago given up on being saved. And somehow, impossibly, Edmund knew this case would cost him far more than sleepless nights. It would cost him his heart. Joe London stopped sleeping after that first meeting. Not because of the charges. Not because of the reporters waiting outside his apartment. Because of Edmund Johnson. The young lawyer's voice lingered in Joe's head long after midnight. The way Edmund had looked at him, not with suspicion, not with pity, but with something dangerously close to belief. Joe wasn't used to that. Belief was fragile. People were not. 3 days later, Joe found himself back in Edmund's office. Rain dripping from his coat, heart guarded behind practiced indifference. Edmund looked up from his laptop, surprise softening instantly into relief. "You came early." Joe shrugged. "Couldn't stay home." Edmund smiled faintly. It wasn't professional. It wasn't guarded. It was real. Something inside Joe twisted. They spent hours combing through bank statements and timelines. Edmund leaned over Joe's shoulder to explain discrepancies, his warmth seeping through the thin fabric of Joe's coat. Every time Edmund moved closer, Joe's body reacted before his mind could stop it. His breath would hitch. His pulse would spike. He hated it. Joe had buried desire alongside grief 3 years ago. Yet here it was, stirring awake because of a man who spoke gently and cared too much. "You're holding tension here," Edmund said softly, noticing Joe's rigid shoulders. "May I?" Joe hesitated, then nodded. Edmund's hand settled on Joe's rigid shoulders. "May I?" Joe hesitated, then nodded. Edmund's hand settled on Joe's shoulders, tentative at first. His thumbs pressed in a tight muscle, slow and careful. Joe sucked in a breath he hadn't realized he was holding. The touch was innocent, but it felt like everything. Joe closed his eyes despite himself. For a moment, he wasn't the accused criminal or the broken widower. He was just a man being held together by someone who didn't yet know how dangerous that was. Edmund pulled away too soon. "Sorry," Edmund murmured. It's fine," Joe said, opening his eyes. His voice was rougher than he intended. They locked gazes. Something unspoken passed between them. After that, the late nights became routine. Coffee at midnight. Shared takeout on stacks of legal folders. Edmund dozing at his desk, while Joe quietly draped his jacket over the lawyer's shoulders. Joe pretending not to notice the way Edmund watched him when he thought Joe wasn't looking. Slowly, carefully, Joe began to talk. Not all at once. In pieces. He told Edmund about meeting his fiancée in a bookstore, about planning a small wedding near the ocean, about getting the phone call that shattered his world, about friends who stopped calling, about nights spent staring at ceilings, wondering how breathing could feel like drowning. Edmund listened without interrupting. Sometimes his eyes would shine. Sometimes his jaw would tighten. Once, Joe noticed Edmund's hand trembling as he reached for his coffee cup. "You don't have to carry this alone," Edmund said one night, voice barely above a whisper. Joe laughed bitterly. "I've been alone for a long time." Edmund reached across the table. He didn't grab Joe's hand. He simply rested his fingers beside it. An invitation. Joe stared at the space between them, at the inch of distance that felt wider than oceans. Then he closed the gap. Their fingers intertwined. Joe expected panic. Instead, warmth spread through his chest, quiet and terrifying. Edmund's grip tightened gently, like he was afraid Joe might vanish. Joe swallowed. "You shouldn't get attached," he said. "I ruin people." Edmund shook his head. You don't know that." I know what I see. Joe looked away. That night, when a storm knocked out power in Edmund's office building, they sat together in near darkness, city lights flickering through the windows. Thunder rolled low and heavy, echoing Joe's heartbeat. Edmund broke the silence. Joe! Joe turned. Edmund's face was soft in the dim light, eyes searching. I think I'm falling for you. The words landed like a slow collapse. Joe stood abruptly. Don't. Edmund rose too. Joe! Joe backed away. I warned you. You don't get to decide what I feel. Joe's chest burned. People who love me lose everything. Edmund stepped closer. Then let me decide that risk. Joe shook his head, breath uneven. You don't understand. Then help me. Joe's restraint finally cracked. He grabbed Edmund's collar and pulled him forward, crashing their mouths together. The kiss was desperate, messy, filled with months of swallowed loneliness and fear. Edmund froze for half a second, then kissed back with equal hunger, hands sliding into Joe's hair. Joe tasted coffee and something sweet. His heart pounded like it was trying to escape. Edmund's fingers curled into Joe's coat, holding him like he was afraid Joe might disappear. Then reality slammed back in. Joe pulled away sharply. Edmund stared at him, lips parted, eyes dark. Joe forced himself to step back. I can't, Joe said hoarsely. I can't do this. Edmund reached for him. Joe turned away. Joe grabbed his coat and left without looking back. He didn't stop walking until the cold air burned his lungs. Back in his apartment, Joe slid down against the door, hands shaking. He pressed his fingers to his lips. They still felt like Edmund, and that terrified him more than any courtroom ever could. The verdict came on a quiet Thursday morning. Not guilty. The words echoed through the courtroom like a bell ringing underwater. Edmund barely heard anything after that. His hands were shaking as he packed his files, his heart pounding with relief, so sharp it almost hurt. Joe London was free. He turned to find Joe standing a few feet away, still, silent, as if he didn't trust happiness enough to reach for it. Edmund crossed the space between them. It's over, Edmund whispered. You're free. Joe nodded once, but there was no smile. Outside the courthouse, reporters shouted questions Joe didn't answer. Edmund shielded him as best he could, guiding him into a waiting cab. Their knees brushed in the back seat, the contact electric and fragile. Edmund wanted to celebrate. He wanted to take Joe somewhere warm and bright, buy him coffee, hold his hands, and tell him everything was going to be okay. Instead, Joe stared out the window. I'm leaving town, Joe said quietly. The words cut deep. Edmund turned to him. What? I've already packed. When? Tonight. Edmund's throat tightened. You didn't think to tell me? Joe finally looked at him. His eyes were exhausted. I didn't want you to try to stop me. Edmund let out a shaky breath. Joe, you don't have to run anymore. Joe gave a small, sad smile. Running is the only thing I'm good at. They ended up back at Edmund's apartment. It happened without planning, without discussion, like gravity had simply pulled them together. Joe stood near the window, city lights painting his silhouette in gold and shadow. Edmund watched him for a long moment, memorizing the slope of his shoulders, the quiet strength in his posture. I meant what I said, Edmund murmured. About falling for you. Joe didn't turn around. You shouldn't. Edmund walked up behind him. He didn't touch him yet. I know you're scared, Edmund said softly. But I'm here. I'm not asking you to be healed. I'm just asking you to stay. Joe closed his eyes. You don't understand, Joe whispered. I'm already gone. Edmund reached out then, wrapping his arms around Joe's waist from behind. Joe stiffened for a second, then leaned back into him, surrendering with a quiet exhale. They stood like that, breathing together. Joe turned slowly. Edmund cupped his face, thumbs brushing beneath tired eyes. You don't have to face everything alone anymore. Joe stared at him like he was trying to imprint Edmund into his bones. Then Joe kissed him. Not desperate this time. Not rushed. It was slow. A kiss that carried grief and gratitude and longing all at once. Edmund melted into it, hands sliding up Joe's back, pulling him closer until there was no space left between them. They moved to the bedroom without speaking. Clothes were shed quietly, reverently. Skin met skin. They lay tangled in sheets, and whispered breaths, holding each other like something fragile and sacred. Joe pressed his forehead to Edmund's. "I don't deserve this," Joe said. Edmund brushed his thumb over Joe's cheekbone. "You don't get to decide that." They didn't rush. They traced scars. They memorized each other's warmth. Joe kissed Edmund's throat like he was afraid it might disappear. Edmund held Joe like he was afraid the same. Later they lay side by side in the dark. Joe rested his head on Edmund's chest, listening to his heartbeat. "I tried loving again once," Joe murmured. "After my fiancé died. It ended badly. He was cruel, made me feel small, like grief was a weakness." Edmund tightened his arms around him. "I'm sorry." Joe swallowed. "That's when I learned something." "What?" "That some people don't want to be saved." Edmund brushed his fingers through Joe's hair. "Maybe they just haven't met the right person yet." Joe didn't answer. Sleep came slowly. Edmund woke sometime before dawn. The space beside him was empty. At first he thought Joe had gone to the bathroom. Then he noticed the silence. Too complete. Edmund sat up. Joe's side of the bed was cold. His chest hollowed instantly. He rushed into the living room. Empty. The kitchen. Empty. On the coffee table sat a folded piece of paper. Edmund's hands shook as he opened it. "Edmund, thank you for seeing me when everyone else decided who I was. Thank you for loving me in a way I don't know how to return. If I stay, I'll only break you. Please don't come looking for me. You deserve someone who can stay." "Joe." Edmund sank onto the couch. His breath came apart. Days blurred together after that. He missed work, ignored calls, replayed every conversation, every smile, every touch. He stood at the cafe where they used to meet, sat on the bench where Joe once leaned his head against Edmund's shoulder. Nothing brought him back. Edmund finally understood. You can fight court cases. You can fight injustice. But you cannot fight someone who has already decided to leave. And loving Joe London meant learning how to hold on to someone who was never truly there. Time did not heal Edmund Johnson. It taught him how to live with the wound. Weeks passed, then months. The city returned to its rhythm, but Edmund moved through it like someone underwater, hearing everything too faintly, feeling everything too slowly. He went back to work. He argued cases, signed documents, smiled at colleagues. He became known again as the young lawyer who never quit. No one knew that every empty chair reminded him of Joe London. At night, Edmund lay awake replaying fragments of memory, Joe's quiet voice. The way he held Edmund like he was something rare. The softness that surfaced only in darkness. Some mornings, Edmund woke reaching for warmth that wasn't there. He stopped drinking coffee after sunset because it reminded him of long nights in his office. Joe leaning against the desk while rain traced stories down the windows. He learned which streets hurt too much to walk. He learned how silence could scream. One afternoon, Edmund received a new client, a young man accused of assault, shaking in the waiting room, eyes hollow with fear. Edmund recognized that look immediately. It was the same one Joe had worn on their first meeting, guarded, exhausted, waiting to be judged. Edmund sat across from him and spoke softly. "You're safe here." The words surprised him. He realized they were still true. He fought hard for that client, harder than usual, not because the case was exceptional, but because loving Joe had taught Edmund something vital. Broken people didn't need perfection. They needed someone who stayed. Late one evening, months after Joe disappeared, Edmund returned to his apartment to find a postcard slipped beneath his door. His heart stuttered. His hands trembled as he picked it up. On the front was a photograph of a quiet coastal town. Pale blue water, empty shorelines, a place that looked like breathing. On the back, in handwriting Edmund would recognize anywhere. "I hope you're still fighting for people like me." That was all. No return address. No explanation. Edmund sank onto the floor, postcard pressed to his chest. So Joe was alive. Somewhere. Still running. Still healing in his own fractured way. Tears finally came, silent and steady. He understood then. Joe hadn't left because Edmund wasn't enough. Joe had left because Edmund mattered too much. Some people didn't walk away from love because they didn't feel it. They walked away because they did. Edmund framed the postcard and placed it on his bookshelf beside his law books. Not as a reminder of loss, but as proof that Joe had existed, that their story had been real. He stopped waiting for Joe to come back, but he never erased him. Spring arrived quietly. Edmund started jogging again in the mornings. He began cooking meals instead of living on takeout. He let his friends pull him out for late dinners and gentle laughter. Sometimes, when the city lights reflected off glass buildings just right, Edmund felt Joe beside him. He let himself feel it. Then he let it pass. One evening, Edmund found himself standing by the ocean. He didn't know why he had driven there. Maybe some part of him hoped the wind might carry Joe's voice. He stood barefoot in the sand, jacket slung over his arm, waves brushing against his ankles. "I loved you," Edmund whispered into the open air. The words dissolved into the tide. He didn't ask for anything in return. He simply released them. Back at work, Edmund took on harder cases. He began volunteering at legal clinics. He spoke at community centers. His compassion sharpened into purpose. He had loved a man who couldn't stay, but that love had not been wasted. It had made him braver, stronger, more human. Sometimes late at night, Edmund still dreamed of Joe. In those dreams, Joe smiled without shadows. They walked together along empty beaches. Joe leaned his head on Edmund's shoulder and stayed. Edmund always woke before the dream could end. He stopped mourning that. Some stories aren't meant to be finished. They're meant to change you. On the anniversary of Joe's acquittal, Edmund visited the courthouse steps alone. He stood where Joe had once stood beside him, silent and unsure how to accept freedom. Edmund closed his eyes. He breathed. He smiled softly. Joe had taught him something no law school ever could, that you can give someone everything and still not be enough to save them. That love doesn't always win, and that some hearts were never meant to be kept, only carried for a while. As Edmund walked away, sunlight warming his back, he felt peace settle gently in his chest. He would always love Joe London, but he no longer needed Joe to come back, because loving him had already changed Edmund forever. And that finally was enough.